Hey, welcome to Neurosaucy. According to a CDC study published in 2020, about 2.2% of adults in the US are autistic. This is about 5.4 million. Still, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what autism is and what autistic people are like. Today, I want to talk about some of the myths and misconceptions people have about autism. There are tons of videos about this topic, but I wanted to cover some of the ones that don't get talked about enough. Myth number one is that all autistic people act the same. Hollywood portrayals have contributed to a stereotype of what an autistic person is like. I'm sure you can picture at least one of these characters in your mind. They all have the same demographics, the same affect, and so on. Most autistic people are not like that. In the autistic community, there's a saying: if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. We all have certain things in common, but we're as diverse in terms of our backgrounds, lifestyles, and ways of being as anyone else. This misconception is a harmful one because, one, it's stereotypical and has been subject to ridicule, and two, it's led to a lot of autistic people being dismissed or undiagnosed. Saying you don't act autistic is not a compliment, by the way. Just because I don't act like Rain Man doesn't make me any less autistic. But because I don't fit that stereotype, I went undiagnosed until I was in my mid-30s. Myth number two is that autism is a mental illness. Autism spectrum disorder in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, also contains information about mood disorders and psychotic disorders, but the DSM encompasses a wide variety of brain conditions, not just mental illnesses. It's also important to keep the historical context in mind. Autism used to be considered a psychiatric condition, but our understanding of it has evolved a lot over the years. We now know it's a neurodevelopmental condition, meaning that it's related to how an autistic person's brain develops. A lot of autistic people also have mental illnesses. These can be genetic, but every single autistic person also lives in a world that's actively hostile to us. So it's no wonder that many of us end up traumatized, anxious, and depressed. Myth number three is that all autistic people are intellectually disabled. There is some crossover between autism and intellectual disability, which is defined as having an IQ score of 70 and impairments to adaptive functioning. As an aside, I could go on for hours about the reasons IQ is pretty bullshit, but in the interest of staying on track, I'll just leave a link in the description that explains how it's bullshit. Anyway, a 2018 study by the CDC found that 31% of autistic children had an intellectual disability, so there is a higher rate, but the CDC also found that ADDM, that's the Autism and Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network, have shown a shift toward children with ASD with higher intellectual ability, as the proportion of children with ASD whose intelligent quotient scores fell within the range of intellectual disability, that's below 70, have decreased gradually over time. In other words, it appears that fewer autistic people are being classified as intellectually disabled as time goes on. It's hard to tell whether that's because we've gotten a better understanding of autism or the diagnosis and research about autism has gotten more accurate or what. One big caveat about autism research in general: there are a lot of biases in medical research and diagnostics, like a lot. This data should be taken with a huge grain of salt, but I'm using it here for illustration. Myth number four is that autistic people are bad communicators. Autism has often been called a communications disorder, which is so funny to me. We're not bad communicators. Non-autistic people are. If we misunderstand or we don't understand something, it's not because we're stupid or we don't listen, it's because it's explained poorly. We do often struggle to communicate in the way that non-autistic people want us to communicate, but that's because the way non-autistic people want us to communicate is sometimes nonsensical. Autistic people say what we mean. We don't have an agenda or an ulterior motive in saying it. If we ask questions, it's because we want to understand what you mean or why something is the way it is. I'll give an example. Say you're with someone and they're upset, but you don't know why. You ask them what's wrong, and they say, "You shouldn't have to ask." Like, "What?" Sorry, I do have to ask. My partner and I are both autistic. If we think the other person is upset, we literally just ask, "Are you upset with me?" Who's the bad communicator here? Another example. Say you're at work or at school and you're given instructions to do something, whether that's writing a paper, doing a report, making an object, or whatever. The instructions are kind of vague, so many people just seem to be allergic to asking for clarification. They'd rather just bumble through and hope for the best. Why not just ask? Some people would rather walk right into traffic than ask a question. Don't get me started on dating. There are so many rules in dating, especially with straight people, that revolve around behavior, but nobody's supposed to talk about them directly. Who came up with these fucking rules? What is the point? Why can't you just talk to each other? Anyway, autistic people can come off as blunt. We might point something out unsolicited or ask a question that is considered awkward. Sometimes we don't have a lot of social graces, or the kind of passive aggressive, timid communication style of a lot of non autistic people, at least in the West, is annoying, and we're just kind of over it. Honestly, everyone would benefit from just being open and saying what the they mean, rather than just kind of dancing around a topic or subtly trying to nudge someone socially and hoping they'll pick up on it. Myth number 5 is that all autistic people are savants or have special abilities. Boy, I wish I was a savant. As it turns out, I'm not, and most autistic people aren't either. Savant syndrome is rare, despite what Hollywood will tell you. Most autistic people have special interests, and their focus on the topic can make them very good at doing something related to it. But the same could be said for anyone. If you spend a lot of time and energy on something, you'll get good at it. That brings up another misconception, which is that all autistic people have one special interest. That's true for some of us, but not all. I have a few, but I'm interested in a lot of things. I don't focus on my special interests to the exclusion of everything else. Myth number 6 is that autistic people are black and white thinkers. I think this is true to some extent, but maybe not in the way you'd think. A lot of people have this idea that we think everything has to be one thing or the other, or we don't understand nuance or gray area, or that we're not good abstract thinkers. That's definitely not true. I taught English for 15 years, and I have degrees in the humanities. My partner, who's also autistic, is a therapist and has degrees in psychology and social work. Our special interests and professions are basically nothing but abstract ideas and gray areas. I don't think we're unusual either. Some autistic people do find it difficult to grasp really abstract ideas or to accept that two things can be true at the same time, but so do some non-autistic people. I do think that we all have a little bit of rigid thinking though, and mostly for little everyday things. It could be like, this bag says groceries on it, so I can only put groceries in it, or I can only drink hot drinks out of this coffee mug, or my favorite food has to be exactly this way. This might sound immature, but sometimes our brains get stuck on something small and can't let it go. It's like the idea is super glued to your brain. Does it make sense? No. Does my brain let me drink soda out of a coffee mug? Absolutely not. Myth number 7 is that autistic people lack empathy. This one is kind of an upsetting one. I've heard autism compared to sociopathy or psychopathy way too many times. We're actually really concerned with how other people feel, and that creates a lot of anxiety for us. The problem is we don't have an instinctive sense of how neurotypical people express their emotions. While you may be able to read someone's body language and know they're upset, for example, we may not pick up on it. This might lead that person to think we're insensitive assholes because we didn't respond to their nonverbal signals, but we literally just don't know. Like I said, this leads to a lot of anxiety. A lot of us worry constantly that we might have done something or said something rude, or that we've offended someone or responded in the wrong way. We don't want to hurt others, so we're constantly on edge and hoping we don't fumble social interactions. Some in the autistic community say that instead of not having enough empathy, autistic people have too much. I'm inclined to agree. Other people's emotions affect us deeply when we can understand them. We can also empathize with animals just as much as humans, and some of us can even empathize with objects. Myth number 8 is that autistic people can't form meaningful relationships. This is kind of connected to the idea of lacking empathy, I think. The assumption is that we can't and don't want to understand other people and aren't interested in socializing. That's probably true for some, but that's not unique to autistic people. As I said, it's hard for us to grasp social interactions a lot of the time, and social situations often cause us a ton of stress. There are factors like demand avoidance and rejection-sensitive dysphoria too. I've done a couple of videos on demand avoidance, and I'll be doing one about rejection-sensitive dysphoria too. In spite of all of that, the problem isn't us. We're not the reason meaningful relationships are hard. It's often that non-autistic people don't bother to get to know us. If we come off as awkward or too quiet or too intense, or people judge us based on harmful stereotypes, we get dismissed or rejected. It's a self-perpetuating cycle where we get rejected so many times we stop trying to be social. Would you want to form communications with people who are constantly trying to brush you off or avoid you? That said, we're absolutely capable of having great relationships, both romantic and platonic. My closest friends are my family, and they accept and value me. I have a partner who I've been with for many years. I may not have as wide a social circle as some, but it's strong. It can be that way for any autistic person, with people who accept and value them as a real person rather than dismissing or judging them because they're different. Myth number 9 is that autistic people are either high functioning or low functioning. The concept of level of functioning is outdated and comes from studies done in the 1980s. It's actually related to IQ and an intellectual disability, with the assumption that people with higher IQ are more functional and people with lower IQ are less functional. This is a hugely oversimplified idea. But what does functional mean anyway? It's a really dehumanizing term, like we're objects or machines that are either functional or broken. Autism is complex, and the way that it shows up in autistic people is complex. Some of us are better at some things than other autistic people are, just like anyone. And just like anyone, we can either be better or worse at dealing with life depending on a lot of factors. The idea that we're always low functioning dismisses and really hobbles the capabilities of someone with higher support needs. A non-speaking autistic person, for example, can be extremely articulate in writing and capable in other parts of their life, but they would be considered low functioning. Likewise, the idea that we're always high functioning sets certain expectations of our capabilities, minimizes our differences, and can prevent us from getting the support we need. For example, I'm educated. I've had a long career. I live independently. I'd be considered high functioning. I can struggle along, and I have done for many years. It's assumed that because of that, I don't actually need help, which I haven't gotten because it's assumed I must not need it because I can do things on my own. Autistic people often need support with different things, but we can be very capable when we have that support. The functioning label hinders both our support needs and our capabilities. Myth number 10 is that the goal of autism treatment is to learn to act like everyone else. This is a big topic that I'll cover in more detail in another video. The common philosophy of autism treatment, especially with kids, is behavioral. If autistic people just learn to act like non-autistic people, everything will be fine. It won't matter that they're autistic. Except it does. An autistic person is more than a set of behaviors. Autism is part of our identity and our way of existing in this world. We shouldn't have to force ourselves to be someone else just to fit in. Telling an autistic person to make eye contact, stop stimming, be social in exactly the right way, or keep their special interest to themselves doesn't make them less autistic. It just tells them that their natural self isn't good enough. Where other people get to live authentically because they already fit in, we just have to learn survival tactics and set aside parts of ourselves or spend a lot of energy just to seem normal. Does that sound fair? If you found this video interesting or if you learned anything new, I hope you'll like the video and subscribe because I'll be posting more about autism and other neurodiversity topics regularly. If you've had any of these misconceptions, you have my permission to forgive yourself for them. Society at large doesn't understand autism that well, so it's understandable that maybe you don't either. Take the information you've learned today and do better. Thanks for watching. I'm working on a master list of credible resources about autism and autism-related topics in a Google document, which you can find in the description. It's very much a work in progress. See you in the next video. Bye!